Shadowlust.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and out of the many years of me being a Star Wars fan, it's kind of interesting in retrospect how I've never really questioned the way Jedis fight with their lightsabers, because movies are supposed to be flashy, it's supposed to be entertaining, and for the most part, they achieve that, except Rey in The Last Jedi. I'll come back to that. And as a kid, that's awesome, and I think my nostalgia has kind of blinded me from looking at it objectively and actually asking, is that the way like a competent warrior swordsman would really fight with one of these? And now that I have done that, I've reached some very interesting conclusions, and it's that the Jedi are doing it all wrong. Okay, look, the Jedi could fight with the way that they're fighting with it, and I'll explain that, but there is a much more efficient and effective way that you would want to fight with this to get the most advantages possible against your opponent. And I think one of the reasons why they've gone wrong with the depiction and how they show Jedi fighting with a lightsaber is that they've treated it too much like a regular sword, when in actual fact, this thing is very different. Like, you could, yes, it's a sword, okay? It's a futuristic laser sword, but swords have different properties. You're not going to fight the same way using a rapier as you would with a long sword. And so the differing and significant properties of a lightsaber really, necessitates but encourages a different style of fighting that we have not seen in the Star Wars universe at all. And that's what I'm going to talk about. And yes, we can see how they've gone down that path. Lightsabers, they're like swords, so we want to make it as authentic as possible. So let's have a look at historical swordsmanship, and thanks to pop culture, stuff like that, they generally feel that their most cool looking sword fighting stuff with one of these, Kenjutsu and stuff. And I'm not bagging on Kenjutsu, but the interesting thing is the katana is an additional step removed in comparison to the katana than, say, even a longsword is, because it has one edge. Yet still, when they actually try to incorporate, historical styles and stuff like that, you can really see an Asian kind of influence, even though a lot of these stances are actually in European sources as well. In one of the fights, he goes all the way up, and we would call this roof stance in HEMA. I don't know what you would call it in Kenjutsu. Someone will tell me in the comments, I'm sure. So we can see they're saying, all right, lightsaber swords, let's try and add a bit of authenticity to it. We'll look to historical swordsmanship, Asian style sources, and incorporate that into the movies. But again, the lightsaber is not a katana. Swords, katanas or longswords, right, generally have some significant elements that are incorporated into the stances that are adopted in historical swordsmanship and the way that they're fought with. For instance, they have edges. A lightsaber doesn't have edges. In fact, the whole thing is an edge. So that alone is going to change a lot of things. The other thing is power generation, okay? So with a sword, if you strike someone, and it could be, any, like a downward strike, go on here and stuff like that, but with any strike, if you're not hitting with enough power behind it, especially if they're wearing something thick like a gambeson, it's actually not going to cut through and do any damage. So power generation becomes a significant thing. And because of this, certain stances have been developed and adopted that encourage and make it easier to generate greater power in striking. When people start getting into sword-like activities, say for instance LARP with the old foam swords and stuff like that, and indeed people who are just starting out even in HEMA, there are certain practices that arise in sparring where you see them kind of like this, and it becomes like a game of sword tag, where they're just trying to touch the person like this, because it's all about points, especially in LARP. You see this a lot in LARP, and they don't need to consider edge alignment or power generation, because all you need to do is touch your opponent to get the point. But I find it interesting that with those two things disregarded, edge alignment and power generation, the natural instinct is to start just trying to touch your opponent. And I actually think that would be some of the initial basic elements of using a lightsaber, because all you need to do is touch your opponent. That's how they did the original series anyway. Okay, so now in that comparison between sword and lightsaber, let's have a look at the lightsaber specifically. So, no edge, and really, if you're going to strike someone, you're going to do as much damage with a strike like that as a strike like that. In fact, just getting touched with a lightsaber could be extremely damaging. This would also affect the standard stances that the Jedi would use. In contrast to a lightsaber, real swords have weight, and you have those things, edge, power generation, and there's other things like edge alignment and stuff like that, in which influences the way you run a fight. And so, for instance, Wrath stance is a very interesting stance because it's great for power generation, but it's also good for a number of other things because it changes the way in which your opponent wants to start attacking you. And so if you were employing, different stances, wrath, roof, it would be with the intent to manipulate your opponent to doing other things, not really to assist in power generation. But there's another thing, in which would affect stances as well, and it's that lightsabers are used not only in just fighting other people with lightsabers, they're used to deflect incoming projectiles. And so this would affect stance in a big way. Because if you were employing something like Wrath stance, or even, is it Jordan Nokima? I can't remember. But this stance, or even that one, you have to move the laser, plasma, energy, field, whatever, over a longer distance to get in the way between you and the blaster bolt, right? And so the more efficient way to protect yourself from incoming projectiles is to have a stance in which the lightsaber is positioned in front of yourself more often than not. And so because of that, this would encourage forward-facing stances with lightsaber combat, and then with the fact that you just want to touch and do these quick cuts and stuff like that, because it's a matter of almost sword tag now, again, forward-facing stances become very useful. And you might be thinking, but that's how the Jedi fight. They do it like this all the time. Yes, okay. But there's another type of stance in which you get more reach and keep your opponents more at bay. And it's an interesting contrast between fighting with two hands on your sword as opposed to one hand. You can actually extend the sword further away from you in one hand than two. Now you might think, hang on, two-handed swords have more reach. That's because they're generally bigger. Because you're using two hands, you can afford using a heavier, bigger sword. It's only slightly heavier, only by like 50%. And then you can get away with them being longer, additional reach. But if the blade lengths were equivalent, okay, you can actually reach further, okay, especially in certain stances like this, with one hand than two, because I can't reach, so I have to bring the sword back to keep both hands on it here. And so if the intent was to keep your opponent as far away from you as possible, and lightsabers are so deadly, I think that would be the intent, you would actually want to get as much reach out of it as you can. You see, the advantage of using two hands on a sword is that you'll be quicker with it because, additional strength, additional leverage. And of course, you can generate a lot more power in the strikes because you're using two hands in the attacks. But you don't need power with a lightsaber. And what about moving it around faster? This is kind of an interesting thing because I have heard some people say that in Star Wars canon, the actual lightsaber part itself is decently heavy, and the Jedi actually use the Force to move it around so quickly than just their physical strength. Whether or not that's the case, I do think you could manipulate this with one hand, because there's another very significant factor that changes the lightsaber from other types of swords. There is no significant weight in the energy portion. All the weight is here, which means the point control you would have over it, with all the weight being focused here, would be tremendous. And if the Jedi are empowered through the strength of their body, or they use the Force to empower themselves, or they use the Force to actually move the lightsaber around, you don't need an additional hand to do that. And so by using the lightsaber in one hand, you get more reach, and you don't need to do huge cuts to generate lots of power. So these quick cuts like this are just as deadly with a lightsaber than big ones going like that. You might be recognizing the style that I've already been using with that lightsaber. It's very similar to rapier style swordsmanship. But the thing is, a rapier still has weight in it, but so much of the weight is concentrated around the hand to get better point control. And the other thing that the rapier lacks, right, is that it's not very good at cutting. It can cut, but it's not very good. And so these little cuts, if you were doing it with a rapier, wouldn't do much at all. Rapier's all about thrusting. And so they have these, and they have the big lunges. And so the key difference between fighting with a rapier and fighting with a lightsaber is that you would employ cutting motions much, much more, and they don't need to be big. You can keep them small and have your defensive point, at your opponent at all times. And this would be the most efficient, effective way of using a lightsaber in real combat if a lightsaber was real. Because remember, you just need to touch him, okay? This thing is so deadly. Small little cuts, and then the opponent just needs to touch you. And so keeping them at bay as much as possible and extending the lightsaber as much as possible from your own body, so you have a high chance of reaching them in either cuts, lunges, whatever you want. And so this is how the Jedi should be using their lightsabers. Stances like this, stances like this, even something like this, okay? Keeping it at a distance. Does it look a bit different or even weird? Yeah, but is it effective, okay? Something much more like this. In fact, they might even want to hold it down here, because it's not going to affect the balance too much, all the weight's here, and they get more reach out of their blade as it cuts things, and it'll be funny, but it'll be cool as well, seeing that, well, you know, Jedi actually fight this thing. And then they're going around like this, and it's very much like rapier fighting, except it cuts. Now, I mentioned earlier on that I was going to comment on Rey's, lightsaber style that you see in a training montage. There's not enough time in this video, so I'm going to make a bonus video explaining how bad it is. So I'll post that video maybe mid next week after this one. Keep an eye out for it. It'll just be something short and fun, but oh my goodness, she is horrible. Talking about the sword fighting specifically, actress, don't know much about her, sure she's a nice person, but the character, obviously Big Mary Sue, and the fight is the same fight, it's so bad. So I hope to see you there, but until that time, farewell.